Okay, so we talked a little bit about Karl Marx, but let's talk about it again. We've just been talking about the functionalists. When we talk about the Karl Marx perspective, we're usually talking about the conflict perspective. Karl Marx believed that the capitalist system of stratification was always going to benefit a few at the expense of the many. So we talked about how Karl Marx pointed out that your plight in life is tied to your relationship to the means of production, and the means of production is the tools and materials needed to produce goods to sell, right? And your classes were either bourgeoisie or proletariat. And bourgeoisie, you own the means of production. Proletariat, you work in them. He also talked about a secondary class, the petite bourgeoisie, which would be independent owners and producers like farmers, small business owners. So he points out that through inheritance laws, social classes reproduce themselves over generation, and that after years of class oppression, capitalism would be toppled. Now, a lot of people think that Karl Marx was advocating communism or encouraging it. That's really not an accurate view of Karl Marx. Karl Marx points out that society has evolved over time and that capitalism is just a step in that evolution. You know, we've had feudalism, slavery, now we have capitalism. And he would say capitalism is better than the things that have come before it, but it is not the end of the stop. There's going to be something beyond this. But he didn't believe that something beyond this would manifest itself until workers gain class consciousness and overthrow this system. But he never described what was coming next. Now, from this conflict perspective, stratification is functional only for those at the top of the social hierarchy. And he also points out that any ruling group, from a slave master to the modern elite, has to develop an ideology to justify their position at the top. And that these ideologies often seduce the oppressed into believing that their welfare, in fact, depends on keeping society stable and keeping the elite happy. And we can see that in the current job creator rhetoric. This is an important visual that you'll want to know. You will see it again. Marx points out we have a base and a superstructure. The base is the red box you see at the bottom, and that would include everything that has to do with the means of production. Okay, machines, factories, raw materials, land, etc. And he says that the base, so the economy, basically, everything that has to do with it, shapes what he calls the superstructure, which is that box in blue there. And superstructure is everything that doesn't have to do with production in society: education, family, religion, politics, media. So because the base is shaping that superstructure, the superstructure maintains and legitimates the base. You think about your experiences in school, for example. How many times have you heard rhetoric that directly supports capitalism? How many times have you heard in school that if you just work hard enough, you'll be successful? That's the kind of stuff that Marx is talking about. This visual gives you a pretty idea of Marx's view of the world, just clearly ponies and rainbows. Here at the bottom, he says that layer is the workers who are bearing the weight of the entire system because they produce all things fundamental to the perpetuating life and continuing the system. And then above them, we have what he calls the parasite class, the bourgeoisie, who exploit the toilers of the world and profit by their labor. Then he puts above that the police and the militia, who he says are not protecting the people, but they're protecting the capital from the people. Above them, he puts the preachers of false consciousness. He would put teachers in that group too. It's not just preachers' religion, okay? And then above that, we have the state, okay? So clearly he had a super, happy view of society and capitalism in general. Some important terms we want to know from Marx. Marx points out that this thing called surplus value, that's a term you're going to want to know. Surplus value comes from, Marx points out, from the exploitation of wage laborers. That the only way as a capitalist that I can get surplus value, which just turned into profit, is when the sale of goods far exceeds the cost of wages and raw materials. So Marx says it's not that the bourgeoisie are jerks, it's that the system, capitalism, demands that they exploit the worker. That's the only way for them to make surplus value. He also points out that part of how all this works is this false consciousness. It says the people in power impose their ideology on the whole society, in part because they own the media and because of that whole base shaping the superstructure thing we just talked about. So, false consciousness is when a person without power accepts an ideology that's contrary to their interest as a class. They may even support laws against their own interests and make sacrifices that benefit the bourgeoisie. And you probably know people like this. You probably know people that, yeah, maybe they even agree with your political leanings, but you think to yourself, like, why do you agree with this? Because it's actually against your own interests. There have been studies of folks who they themselves receive government benefits like food stamps, etc., who are doing these interviews about how terrible it is that the government gives out food stamps and we got to put a stop to that. That's false consciousness. And then we talked about class consciousness a little bit. This is when members of a social class become aware of themselves as a class. And Marx says false consciousness is going to exist until the exploited class develops a sense of class consciousness. And that once they become aware of themselves as a class, they will unite in pursuit of their collective interests and challenge the power classes. So when we're looking at a sociological analysis of stratification and class, we look from the functionalist perspective. We talked about that a little bit. Lower class provides a pool of inexpensive laborers that keep price down. The poor buffer the lower middle class from economic changes. This idea that people have different skill and knowledge and different opportunities. We have the conflict perspective. We just talked about that. Stratification and class are the results of inequality in the distribution of wealth, which is sustained by exerting the I can make words. I can by the elite exerting power. And then we have the symbolic interactionist perspective, which is people in lower classes often adopt the value systems of those in power and see themselves as unworthy. Who are the poor? They represent 13.5% of us. 43 million folks living in poverty. And when you look at the breakdown, you quickly see that the larger percentages of those groups are folks who are not white, who are minority members of society. Now, you'll hear people say there are more poor whites than poor blacks or poor Hispanics. That's true by the numbers. That's absolutely true. But when we look at the percentage, the proportions of folks, proportionately, there are fewer whites than there are of other minority groups. Now, here comes the question. How does inequality impact you? We've spent a lot of time talking about inequality. And before we wrap up, I want to spend a couple minutes thinking about how that's changing and why. Over the last 3 decades, our economy has shifted from an industrial economy to an information economy. And this is a huge shift, and it's had significant consequences for a large number of people. Manufacturing jobs have left the country, and many men, for example, have had jobs cut because they work in industries that are traditionally male. Job growth is coming mainly in the pink sector, which is considered female type jobs, service industries, for example. Minimum wage remains inadequate to support a family. The majority of families now require 2 incomes to achieve the standard of living the previous generation accomplished with 1. And it's also worth remembering that inequality has been on the rise for the past 3 to 4 decades here in the United States. Many sociologists and economists have been studying this phenomenon and will continue to do so, putting all our tools to work to better understand this shift. People are better educated but poorer. We have a higher percentage of folks who have higher education, but they're making less money. We look at living arrangements for 25 to 32-year-olds. We very quickly see that millennials, fewer of them are married, and more of them are living in their parents' home than previous generations. And while lots of people want to make all sorts of comments about traits of millennials and what that says about them, we know that this has to do with economic issues in the current economic circumstances. We look at unemployment rate for millennials, 25 to 32-year-olds. Very quickly see they're the dark green line there. We quickly see that their rates are much higher than previous generations, regardless of their educational attainment. We look at how much they're actually earning with the same degrees. We can see that millennials between the ages of 25 and 32 do earn more the more education that they make, okay? But they are making up a lot of the unemployment rate, and many of them are living in poverty. We look at previous generations. Millennials are the green there. Okay. And we look at ever married. Fewer of them are married. More of them live in poverty. More of them have a college degree. More of them live with their parents, except for World War II, right after the war. More of them are unemployed as well. All this leads to what we call the inequality effect, which is the fact that living in poor neighborhoods contributes to a variety of health problems and shortening lifespans. The inequality effect is the fact that living in a community with income disparity shortens your lifespan, makes your life more stressful compared with equal neighborhoods. So the bottom line here is that social inequality absolutely matters, and it impacts all the realms of our lives. I do apologize for all of the technical difficulties with this week's lecture. Hopefully we can get this worked out as we move forward.